Some men carry their secrets in their hearts, but Eli Renner carried his in his swollen ear. For 37 years, he'd learned that silence was survival, that asking questions about the past only brought pain to the present. The throbbing had started months ago, a dull ache he dismissed as another reminder of hard living on the frontier. Ranch work was unforgiving, and at his age, a man expected his body to speak up about old injuries. But as autumn settled over the valley, the pain had grown into something he couldn't ignore. Dizzy spells struck without warning, threatening to drop him in front of the very cattle he'd spent a decade learning to handle. What was hiding beneath Eli's skin that would shock an experienced frontier doctor? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Broken Arrow Ranch as Eli Renner adjusted his worn leather gloves and squinted toward the eastern pasture. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the cattle moved restlessly in the early light, their breath forming small clouds that dissolved into the pale sky. At 37, Eli had learned to read the subtle signs that marked each day's rhythm, the way the horses held their ears, the direction of the wind, the particular quality of light that warned of weather changes. He'd been working this land for 3 years now, ever since his Uncle Nathan had passed and left him the modest spread tucked into the valley outside Sage Creek. Before that, he'd spent a decade drifting from ranch to ranch across the territory, never staying long enough for anyone to ask too many questions about where he'd come from or why a man his age had no family ties to speak of. The Broken Arrow suited him small enough to manage with just 2 hands, isolated enough that neighbors respected a man's privacy, and far enough from the main cattle trails that strangers rarely found reason to visit. The ranch house itself was a simple affair, built from local timber with a stone foundation that had weathered 40 years of frontier seasons. Uncle Nathan had been a practical man, more concerned with function than comfort, and the house reflected that sensibility. A covered porch wrapped around the front and east side, offering shade in summer and protection from winter winds. Inside, the rooms were sparse but clean: a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove, and 2 bedrooms that Eli had scarcely furnished beyond the necessities. Miguel Esperanza, his most trusted hand, emerged from the barn leading Eli's sorrel gelding, already saddled for the morning ride. Miguel had worked for Nathan before Eli arrived, and his steady presence had been one of the main reasons Eli had decided to stay and work the ranch rather than sell it off. The older man possessed the kind of wisdom that came from years of reading both animals and men, and he'd never once pressed Eli about his past, accepting his employer's reticence as naturally as he accepted the changing seasons. "Morning, boss," Miguel called, his weathered face creased with the beginning of a smile. "Looks like some of the yearlings wandered into the north section overnight. Want me to take Johnny and bring them back to the main herd?" Eli nodded, accepting the reins with hands that had grown calloused and steady over his years of ranch work. "Good idea. I'll check the fence line along Willow Creek. Been meaning to replace that section before the snow flies." As he swung into the saddle, a sudden wave of dizziness struck without warning. The world tilted sideways for a moment, and Eli gripped the saddle horn instinctively, feeling his vision blur at the edges. The throbbing in his left ear intensified, accompanied by a strange ringing that made the morning sound seem distant. And muffled. Miguel stepped forward, concern evident in his dark eyes. "You all right, Eli? You've been looking a little peaked lately." Eli straightened in the saddle, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Just stood up too fast. Nothing a little fresh air won't cure." But even as he spoke the words, Eli knew this was more than simple fatigue. The pain in his ear had been building for months, starting as an occasional ache that he'd attributed to a knock from an ornery calf or perhaps the residual effects of too many cold nights sleeping under stars during his drifting years. Ranch work was hard on the body, and at 37, he expected certain reminders of the physical toll his life had taken. The swelling had begun sometime in late summer, a gradual puffiness around his left ear that made his hat fit differently. He told himself it was nothing more than an infection that would clear up on its own, the way most minor ailments did if a man was patient and didn't coddle himself. But as the weeks passed, the swelling had grown more pronounced, and with it came the dizzy spells that threatened his balance at the most inconvenient moments. Riding the fence line that morning, Eli's mind wandered to the small collection of belongings that represented all he knew of his family history. In the attic of the ranch house, stored in a battered wooden trunk, lay the few items his uncle had saved from Eli's childhood, items that had belonged to his father before the man had vanished when Eli was 12 years old. The centerpiece of that meager collection was his father's cavalry saber, a weapon that had seen service during the Indian Wars and bore the scratches and tarnish of hard use. The brass guard was engraved with his father's initials JTR, and the blade, though nicked in places, still held a keen edge. Eli had spent countless hours as a boy studying that saber, imagining the battles it had seen, and the man who had wielded it with what Uncle Nathan claimed was considerable skill. James Thomas Renner had been a career soldier. According to the stories, a man who'd served with distinction in various frontier campaigns before settling briefly in the small town where Eli had been born. But the details of his father's service remained frustratingly vague, and Uncle Nathan had always grown uncomfortable when pressed for specifics. All Eli knew for certain was that his father had disappeared one night when Eli was 12, leaving behind only a brief note saying he had to go away for a while and would return when it was safe. That had been 25 years ago, and Eli had long since stopped expecting his father to walk through any door. The memory of his father's disappearance carried with it other, more troubling recollections, fragments of conversations he'd overheard as a child, whispered discussions between his father and men who visited their small house at odd hours. These visitors had worn suits despite the frontier setting, and they'd spoken in the careful, measured tones that Eli had later learned to associate with government officials. Even as a boy, he'd sensed the tension these visits brought, the way his father's jaw would tighten and his eyes would take on a distant, troubled expression. After his father's disappearance, the men in suits had continued to visit occasionally, asking Uncle Nathan careful questions about Eli's whereabouts and well-being. These visits had gradually ceased as Eli grew older, but the memory of them still carried an undercurrent of unease that he'd never fully understood. Shaking off these old memories, Eli focused on the task at hand, checking the fence posts along Willow Creek for signs of damage or wear. The physical work helped distract from the persistent ache in his ear, though he noticed the bending over to examine the lower fence rails brought on brief moments of disorientation that forced him to steady himself against the post stop by midday. The sun had climbed high enough to warm the air, and Eli paused to rest his horse by the creek. The clear water moved slowly over smooth stones, creating a gentle murmur that should have been soothing, but instead seemed to aggravate the ringing in his ear. He dismounted carefully, testing his balance before walking to the water's edge to fill his canteen. It was then that he noticed Miguel approaching at a steady lope, his expression urgent in a way that immediately set Eli on alert. The older man reined in his horse and leaned forward in the saddle, his weathered face creased with concern. "Boss, you need to know there's been folks asking questions about you in town," Miguel said without preamble. Johnny heard it from the barkeeper at the Sage Creek Saloon. "Couple of men in town yesterday, well-dressed types, not the usual sort we see around here. They were asking about the Broken Arrow, about who's been running it since Nathan passed." Eli felt a familiar chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that make honest folks uncomfortable," Miguel replied. Johnny said they seemed more interested in you personal-like than in any business matters. Asked about how long you'd been here, whether you ever talked about your family, that sort of thing. The throbbing in Eli's ear intensified, accompanied by a wave of nausea that made him grip his horse's reins more tightly. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt sideways again, and he found himself wondering if the timing of these questions was merely coincidental or somehow connected to his worsening condition. Did Johnny get a good look at them? Eli asked, working to keep his voice casual despite the alarm bells ringing in his mind. Said they looked like government men, Miguel replied, and Eli noticed the older man's careful choice of words. Miguel had been around long enough to recognize the type, and his tone suggested he understood the potential implications better than he was letting on. That evening, as Eli sat on his porch watching the sun set behind the distant mountains, he found himself touching the swollen area around his ear with unconscious frequency. The simple gesture had become a habit over the past few weeks, a reflexive response to the constant discomfort that seemed to worsen with stress or fatigue. The questions Miguel had reported troubled him more than he cared to admit. In his years of drifting, Eli had developed an instinct for when it was time to move on, a sense for when too many people were asking too many questions about things that were better left alone. But this time felt different. This time, he had roots modest though they were, and the thought of abandoning the broken arrow and returning to a life of constant movement filled him with a weariness that went bone-deep. As darkness settled over the valley, Eli made a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd cultivated over the past decade. Instead of packing his few belongings and disappearing into the night as he'd done so many times before, he would stay and face whatever was coming. But first, he needed to understand what was happening to him, and that meant swallowing his pride in seeking help for the condition that was becoming impossible to ignore. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost silvering the grass and a sharp wind blowing down from the high country. Eli woke before sunrise, as was his habit, but found himself lying in bed longer than usual, fighting waves of dizziness that seemed to intensify when he tried to sit up. The pain in his ear had developed a new quality overnight, a sharp, pulsing sensation that seemed to echo in rhythm with his heartbeat. When he finally managed to rise and dress, Eli caught sight of himself in the small mirror that hung above his washstand. The reflection that looked back at him showed the clear signs of his deteriorating condition. The left side of his face was noticeably swollen, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of poor sleep and constant discomfort. Miguel was already in the barn when Eli emerged from the house, and the older man's expression showed immediate concern at his employer's appearance. "Boss, you look like death warmed over," Miguel said bluntly. "When's the last time you saw a doctor?" Eli started to deflect the question with his usual dismissive response, but the words died in his throat as another wave of dizziness forced him to steady himself against the barn door. The simple act of walking from the house to the barn had left him feeling as though he'd run a mile, and he could no longer pretend that whatever was wrong with him would resolve itself given time. "There's a doctor in Sage Creek," Eli admitted reluctantly. "Woman named Shaw, I think. Heard she's supposed to be competent." "More than competent," Miguel confirmed. "Dr. Meredith Shaw. She came out here from back east a few years ago after her husband passed. Folks say she's the best medical help this side of Denver, though she keeps to herself mostly. Lives in that big house on Elm Street, the one with the iron fence around it." Eli nodded slowly, already regretting the decision he was about to make, but knowing he had little choice. The questions being asked about him in town suggested that whatever was happening, it was bigger than a simple medical problem, and if he was going to face it, he needed to be in condition to think clearly and move quickly when the time came. "Tell Johnny to handle the morning chores," Eli said finally. "I'm riding into town." The ride into Sage Creek took longer than usual, with Eli stopping twice the rest when waves of dizziness threatened to unseat him. Each time he dismounted, the world seemed to sway gently, as though he were standing on the deck of a ship in calm seas. The sensation was profoundly unsettling for a man who'd spent his adult life depending on his physical steadiness and quick reflexes. Dr. Meredith Shaw's house stood at the end of Elm Street, like a fortress of respectability in the dusty frontier town. The two-story structure was built of brick, a luxury in these parts, and surrounded by an ornate iron fence that spoke of both wealth and a desire for privacy. A small brass plaque beside the front gate read, "Shaw, M.D." in simple, dignified lettering. Eli tied his horse to the hitching post and made his way up the stone walkway, noting the well-tended garden that surrounded the house. Someone had taken considerable care to cultivate roses and other delicate flowers. That seemed almost miraculous in the harsh frontier climate. The attention to detail suggested a person of both patience and skill qualities that Eli hoped would extend to medical practice. The woman who answered his knock was perhaps 65, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent gray, eyes that seemed to take his measure in a single glance. She wore a simple dark dress with a white apron, and her hands, which Eli noticed immediately, were clean and steady, with the kind of precise movements that spoke of years of delicate work. "Mr. Renner, I presume," she said before he could introduce himself. "Miguel Esperanza sent word you might be coming by. I'm Dr. Shaw. Please, come in." The interior of the house reinforced Eli's impression of cultivated respectability. The furniture was well made and comfortable, the walls lined with medical texts and what appeared to be several diplomas from Eastern universities. A grandfather clock in the corner marked the time with a steady, reassuring tick that seemed to echo the pulse of pain in Eli's ear. Dr. Shaw led him to a small room that had clearly been converted into an examination area. Medical instruments gleamed on a white cloth spread across a wooden table, and the smell of carbolic acid hung faintly in the air. A sign that this frontier doctor took the latest theories about cleanliness and infection seriously. "Please have a seat," Dr. Shaw said, indicating a chair positioned to catch the light from a large window. "Miguel mentioned you've been having problems with your ear. How long has this been troubling you?" Eli settled into the chair, grateful to be sitting down after the difficult ride into town. "Started maybe 3 months ago. Just a little ache at first, nothing worth mentioning. But it's gotten worse lately, and the swelling," he gestured toward the left side of his face. "Well, you can see for yourself." Dr. Shaw moved closer, her movements precise and professional as she began her examination. Her fingers were gentle, but thorough as she palpated the swollen area around his ear, and Eli noticed that she seemed to be paying particular attention to the shape and consistency of the swelling rather than simply checking for signs of infection. "Have you experienced any discharge from the ear?" she asked, tilting his head to get a better angle of examination. "No, ma'am. No discharge, but there's been ringing, and lately some dizzy spells that come on without warning." Dr. Shaw's hands stilled for a moment, and Eli caught a flicker of something surprise, recognition, in her expression before her professional mask returned. She reached for a small metal instrument and continued her examination, probing more deeply into the ear canal. "Mr. Renner, I need to ask you some questions that may seem unrelated to your current condition," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Have you ever had any surgical procedures performed on your ears, perhaps as a child?" The question struck Eli as odd, and he found himself searching his memory for any recollection of such a thing. "Not that I recall. I mean, I was pretty sickly as a boy, always catching one thing or another, but I don't remember any surgery." "What about your family medical history? Any hereditary conditions I should be aware of?" Eli shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I wouldn't know much about that. My father disappeared when I was 12, and my mother died when I was born. Uncle Nathan raised me, but he wasn't much for talking about family medical matters. Dr. Shaw's examination continued, but Eli noticed that her questions were becoming more specific and somehow more urgent. She asked about his father's military service, about whether he remembered any visits from doctors during his childhood, about gaps in his memory that might suggest periods of illness or injury he'd forgotten. With each question, Eli felt his unease growing. This didn't feel like a routine medical examination anymore. It felt like an interrogation conducted with surgical instruments instead of harsh lights and aggressive questioning. Dr. Shaw, he said finally, "What exactly are you looking for? This isn't a normal infection, is it?" She stepped back from her examination, setting down her instruments with careful precision. For a long moment, she studied his face with an expression that seemed to balance compassion against some internal calculation. "Mr. Renner, what I'm about to tell you may be difficult to accept," she began slowly. "The swelling in your ear doesn't appear to be caused by infection or injury. Based on what I can determine through external examination, there appears to be a foreign object embedded in the tissue, something that was placed there deliberately and with considerable surgical skill." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. "What do you mean, placed there? Are you saying someone—" "I'm saying that what you're experiencing isn't a medical condition in the traditional sense. Someone, at some point in your past, surgically implanted something in your ear. The swelling and pain you're experiencing now suggests that whatever was implanted is becoming active or perhaps beginning to malfunction." Eli stood up abruptly, his mind reeling. The motion triggered another wave of dizziness, and he had to grip the back of the chair to steady himself. "That's impossible. I would remember something like that." Dr. Shaw moved to a cabinet and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully and turned it so Eli could see the detailed medical drawings and notes that filled the pages. "Mr. Renner, I need you to understand that what I'm about to share with you is information I've kept private for many years. My late husband was a military physician who worked on classified projects during his service. Some of those projects involved experimental medical procedures that were conducted without the full knowledge or consent of the subjects." She turned several pages in the journal, revealing increasingly detailed diagrams of what appeared to be small mechanical devices and surgical techniques for their implantation. These devices were designed to track the location of individuals who had been exposed to sensitive military information. They were implanted in soldiers, their families, and in some cases, their children. Eli sank back into the chair, his mind struggling to process what Dr. Shaw was telling him. "You're saying my father was involved in something like this?" "I'm saying it's possible. The surgical technique used in your case matches what my husband documented in his journals, and the fact that you're experiencing symptoms now suggests that the device may be responding to some kind of external signal, perhaps being activated after years of dormancy." Dr. Shaw closed the journal and looked at him with an expression of genuine sympathy. "Mr. Renner, I need some time to research this further and to determine the safest way to proceed. Can you return in 3 days? In the meantime, I strongly advise you to avoid any unnecessary travel or exposure. If my suspicions are correct, there may be people looking for you who are connected to whatever project resulted in your implantation." As Eli prepared to leave, his mind was flooded with memories he'd tried to suppress. The men in suits who had visited during his childhood, the whispered conversations between his father and Uncle Nathan, the sense of living under some invisible threat that had never been fully explained. The questions that had been asked about him in town suddenly took on a much more ominous significance. Dr. Shaw walked him to the door, her manner professional but tinged with obvious concern. "Mr. Renner, I want you to know that whatever happened to you was not your fault. You were a child, and children don't have the power to consent to such procedures. What we need to focus on now is keeping you safe and finding a way to resolve this situation." As Eli mounted his horse for the ride back to the ranch, he noticed that Dr. Shaw remained at her window, watching his departure with the intensity of someone who had just made a discovery that would change everything. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Sage Creek's main street, and Eli found himself studying every face he passed, wondering if any of them might be connected to the mysterious project that had apparently marked him for life. The ride home seemed to take forever, with each mile bringing new waves of paranoia and self-doubt. Had his entire life been shaped by forces he'd never understood? Were the years of drifting and the instinct to avoid questions really his own choices, or the result of some unconscious programming designed to keep him moving and hidden? By the time he reached the Broken Arrow, the sun was setting behind the mountains, and Eli felt as though he were seeing his modest ranch with entirely new eyes. What had seemed like a peaceful refuge now felt exposed and vulnerable, a place where a man with secrets might easily be found and cornered by those who knew how to look. That night, Eli sat on his porch long after darkness had fallen, one hand unconsciously touching the swollen area around his ear, while his mind raced through the implications of Dr. Shaw's revelation. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled a lonely sound that seemed to echo his own growing sense of isolation and uncertainty about what the morning might bring. The sleepless night that followed Eli's visit to Dr. Shaw stretched endlessly, filled with fragments of half-remembered dreams and the constant nagging pain that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. Every creak of the old house settling, every whisper of wind through the eaves, made him wonder if someone was approaching under cover of darkness. By the time dawn broke over the mountains, Eli had made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation he'd developed over the years. He was going to search through his father's belongings and find answers, regardless of what doors that search might open. The attic of the ranch house was a cramped space beneath the sloping roof, accessible only by a narrow ladder that Uncle Nathan had built years ago. Eli had ventured up there only once since inheriting the property, and that had been simply to ensure the roof wasn't leaking during a particularly hard spring rain. Now, climbing the ladder with his balance compromised by the dizziness that came and went without warning, he felt like he was ascending into his own past, a past that had apparently been shaped by forces he'd never understood. The space was dusty and dim, lit only by the pale morning light that filtered through a small window at the gable end. Scattered around the rough wooden floor were the accumulated remnants of 2 generations of frontier, living Uncle Nathan's old cavalry gear, some farming equipment too worn to use but too valuable to throw away, and in the far corner, a battered wooden trunk that Eli knew contained his father's effects. Thought the trunk had been Uncle Nathan's doing. After James Renner's disappearance, Nathan had gathered up everything that belonged to his brother and stored it away, telling 12-year-old Eli that someday he might want to look through his father's things, but that the boy was too young to understand them properly. Over the years, Eli had occasionally thought about opening that trunk, but something had always held him back, perhaps an unconscious fear of what he might discover, or maybe just a superstitious belief that some doors were better left unopened. Now, kneeling beside the trunk in the dusty attic, Eli felt his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the heavy lid. The hinges creaked in protest, and the smell that arose was the particular mixture of leather, tobacco, and something medicinal that he dimly remembered from his childhood. The first items he encountered were his father's military uniforms, carefully folded and preserved despite the passage of years. The blue wool of the cavalry jacket still showed the traces of careful maintenance, and the brass buttons, though tarnished, retained enough of their original shine to reflect the morning light. Beneath the uniforms lay a collection of personal items, a silver pocket watch that had stopped running years ago, a leather-bound Bible with numerous passages marked in faded ink, and a daguerreotype of a young woman who Eli assumed must be his mother. But it was what lay beneath these more personal items that made Eli's breath catch in his throat. Wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string was a bundle of papers that, when unwrapped, revealed themselves to be military telegrams and correspondence. The papers were yellowed with age, and some of the ink had faded to the point of being barely legible. But what Eli could make out sent a chill down his spine. The telegrams were addressed to Lieutenant J.T. Renner and bore the official seals of various military departments. Most were routine communications about troop movements and supply requisitions, but several contained references to something called Project Meridian and used language that even to Eli's untrained eyes seemed deliberately vague and coded. One telegram in particular caught his attention. Lieutenant Renner, stop Project Meridian Phase 2, approved stop report to Facility 7 for briefing on subject preparation, stop discretion, absolute stop, Colonel Hayes commanding. Another, dated several months later, was even more ominous. Subject resistance noted, stop recommend. Immediate implementation protocol, Delta stop, family security measures in effect. Stop, acknowledge receipt. As Eli read through more of the correspondence, a picture began to emerge of his father's involvement in some kind of military project that required extreme secrecy and involved procedures that were apparently being performed on unwilling subjects. Several of the documents made reference to enhanced tracking capabilities and long-term monitoring protocols, language that took on new and terrifying significance in light of Dr. Shaw's revelation about the device implanted in his ear. The final item in the bundle was not a telegram, but a handwritten letter in his father's familiar script. The paper was of better quality than the official correspondence, and the ink, though faded, was still clearly legible. If you are reading this, then something has happened to me, and you have finally decided to learn the truth about our family. I pray that day never comes, but if it does, you need to know that everything I did was to protect you and to stop something terrible from continuing. Project Meridian was supposed to be about keeping our soldiers safe, but it became something else entirely, a way to control people who had learned too much or seen too much. They wanted to use you as a test subject to see if the procedures would work on children. I couldn't let that happen, so I took you away and made sure you would be hidden. But I fear they may have done something to you before I could stop them. If you ever start feeling sick in ways that don't make sense, find someone you can trust and get help. The device they use can be removed, but only by someone who understands what they're dealing with. I'm sorry for the life this has given you, son. You deserve better than to live in the shadow of my mistakes. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakably his father's. Eli read it through twice, his hands shaking more with each word. The implications were staggering. Not only had his father been involved in some kind of military experiment, but Eli himself had apparently been targeted as a subject. The years of drifting, the instinctive avoidance of questions about his past, the sense of always looking over his shoulder, all of it suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. A sound from below made Eli freeze. Through the floorboards, he could hear voices in the house, Miguel's familiar tones, but also another voice he didn't recognize. Moving as quietly as possible, Eli gathered up the papers and made his way to the attic window, where he could look down into the yard. A man in a dark suit was talking with Miguel near the barn, and even from this distance, Eli could see the tension in his foreman's posture. The stranger was asking questions, and Miguel was answering with the careful, measured responses of someone who had learned not to volunteer information to the wrong people. As Eli watched, the stranger handed Miguel what appeared to be a business card, and then walked back toward a black carriage that had been parked out of sight of the house. Just before climbing into the carriage, the man looked up toward the attic window, and for a moment, Eli felt certain their eyes met across the distance. The carriage pulled away, but Eli remained at the window until it had disappeared entirely. Down the road toward Sage Creek. When he finally climbed down from the attic, clutching the bundle of papers against his chest. He found Miguel waiting for him in the kitchen, his weathered face creased with worry. "That fellow was asking about you again," Miguel said without preamble. "Said he was from some government office back east. Wanted to know about your health, whether you've been to see any doctors lately. I told him you keep your business to yourself. But he seemed to already know you'd been to see Dr. Shaw." Eli set the bundle of papers on the kitchen table, his mind racing through the implications. If the government men already knew about his visit to Dr. Shaw, then they were watching him more closely than he'd realized. And if they were asking about his health, then they probably knew about the device and might even be responsible for its recent activation. "Miguel," Eli said slowly, "how long have you known me?" The older man's expression grew thoughtful. 3 years since you took over the ranch, but I've been watching men for a lot longer than that, and I can tell when someone's carrying weight they don't want to talk about. You want to tell me what's really going on here?" Eli looked at his foreman's honest, weathered face and made another decision that went against his instincts for secrecy and self-protection. "Sit down, Miguel. I think it's time you knew why those government men are so interested in a simple ranch hand." 3 days later, Eli made his way back to Dr. Shaw's house with Miguel riding alongside him, a precaution they'd agreed upon after the government man's visit to the ranch. The papers from his father's trunk were folded carefully in his jacket pocket, and his mind was still reeling from everything he'd learned about Project Meridian and his family's involvement in whatever dark experiment the military had been conducting. Dr. Shaw met them at her front door, and Eli immediately noticed that she looked as though she hadn't slept well since their last meeting. Her usually neat appearance showed signs of strain, and there was an urgency in her manner that suggested she'd spent the intervening days researching his condition with considerable intensity. "Mr. Renner, please come in," she said, glancing briefly at Miguel. "Your friend is welcome to wait in the parlor if he'd prefer not to be involved in medical discussions." "Miguel knows everything," Eli replied. "At this point, I figure the more people who understand what's happening, the better chance I have of surviving it." Dr. Shaw nodded and led them both into her examination room, where Eli noticed that additional medical texts had been opened on her desk alongside what appeared to be several official-looking documents. She gestured for him to take the same chair he'd occupied during his previous visit, but this time her examination was much more focused and specific. "Mr. Renner, before we proceed, I need to share with you what I've discovered through my research." She began, settling into a chair across from him with a leather portfolio balanced on her knees. "What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but I believe you have the right to know the full truth about your condition." She opened the portfolio and withdrew a photograph, a formal military portrait of a man in uniform who appeared to be in his 40s. The face was stern but intelligent, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of years of frontier service. "This is my late husband, Dr. Marcus Shaw," she said, offering the photograph for Eli's inspection. He served as a military physician for 15 years before his retirement, and for the last 5 years of his service, he was assigned to a classified program that was conducting experimental medical procedures on soldiers and their families. Eli studied the photograph, noting the man's steady gaze and the array of medals and decorations visible on his uniform. "This Project Meridian that's mentioned in my father's papers?" "The same," Dr. Shaw confirmed. Marcus was initially enthusiastic about the project, believing it would provide new ways to keep track of soldiers in dangerous situations and ensure their safety during covert operations. But as the program expanded, he became increasingly troubled by what he was being asked to do. She withdrew another document from the portfolio, this one bearing official military seals and marked with classified stamps in red ink. The devices that were implanted were far more sophisticated than simple tracking instruments. They were designed to monitor not just location, but physiological responses, stress levels, and in some cases, to influence behavior through targeted electrical stimulation. Eli felt his mouth go dry. You're saying they can control people with these things? To a limited extent, yes. The technology was primitive by today's standards, but effective enough for basic behavioral modification. More importantly, for your current situation, the devices were designed to be activated remotely when subjects needed to be located or recalled for additional procedures. Dr. Shaw turned to a page in her husband's journal and showed Eli a detailed, technical drawing of what appeared to be a small mechanical device no larger than a coin. The diagram was labeled with various components and included notes about surgical implantation techniques. Marcus documented everything, despite explicit orders not to keep records of the procedures. He believed that someday someone would need this information to help the people who had been subjected to these experiments. Miguel leaned forward from his position near the window. Doc, are you saying this thing in Eli's head can be taken out? It can be removed, but the procedure is extremely delicate. The device was designed to integrate with the surrounding tissue in such a way that removal requires precise knowledge of its construction and placement. Attempting to remove it without proper understanding could result in severe brain damage or death. Dr. Shaw reached into a wooden box on her desk and withdrew a military metal bronze star with ribbons that had faded with age. Marcus received this for his service, but by the end of his involvement with Project Meridian, he considered it a mark of shame rather than honor. He tried to expose what was being done, and for his efforts, he was transferred to a remote posting, where he spent the remainder of his military career treating routine ailments and filing reports that no one read. She held the medal for a moment, her expression distant with memory, before continuing. After his retirement, Marcus spent years trying to locate the subjects who had been implanted, hoping to find a way to help them. He believed that the devices would eventually begin causing health problems as they aged, and their components began to deteriorate, which is what's happening to me now, Eli said, touching the swollen area around his ear. Exactly. The symptoms you're experiencing, the pain, the swelling, the dizziness, all indicate that the device is malfunctioning. But there's something else you need to understand. The recent activation of your symptoms suggests that someone is attempting to locate you through the device's tracking capabilities. Eli pulled the bundle of papers from his jacket and placed them on Dr. Shaw's desk. I found these in my father's belongings. I think they explain why the government men have been asking questions about me. Dr. Shaw examined the papers with growing intensity, her expression becoming more troubled with each document she read. When she reached his father's handwritten letter, she set it down carefully and looked at Eli with something approaching amazement. Your father was Lieutenant James Renner, she said, and it wasn't a question. Marcus wrote about him extensively in his journals. Your father was one of the few officers who attempted to resist the program from within. According to Marcus's notes, Lieutenant Renner tried to prevent the implantation of devices in family members, particularly children who couldn't consent to the procedures. The letter mentions that they wanted to use me as a test subject, Eli said quietly. Children were considered ideal subjects because their growing bodies would better integrate with the devices, and their developing minds would be more susceptible to behavioral modification. Your father's resistance probably saved you from much worse procedures, but it appears they managed to implant at least a basic tracking device before he could prevent it. Dr. Shaw stood and moved to a cabinet on the far side of the room, from which she withdrew a larger journal bound in dark leather. Marcus kept detailed records of every subject he encountered, including sketches of the specific devices used, and notes about their individual cases. If I'm correct about your identity, there should be an entry about you in these records. She flipped through the pages with practiced efficiency, finally stopping at an entry that made her draw in a sharp breath. Here it is. Subject E. Renner. Age approximately 7. implanted with Model 3 tracking device following unsuccessful resistance by subject's father. Device placed in left temporal area due to subject's age and size constraints. Father terminated from program. Following security breach. Subject relocated with family member outside of program supervision. The clinical language of the entry struck Eli like a physical blow. To see his childhood trauma reduced to a few lines of medical notation was somehow worse than not knowing at all. He had been nothing more than a test subject, a data point in someone's experiment. "There's more," Dr. Shaw continued, her voice gentle but determined. Marcus noted that the Model 3 devices were equipped with emergency activation protocols. If the program administrators believed a subject posed a security risk or needed to be recalled, they could trigger the device remotely, causing the kinds of symptoms you're experiencing now. "So someone's looking for me," Eli said, the pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to form a complete picture. "Yes, and they're using your own body to track you down." The good news is that Marcus also documented removal procedures for the Model 3 devices. The surgery is complex, but it can be done safely with the right knowledge and equipment. Miguel, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, finally spoke up. "Doc, what you're talking about removing this thing from Eli's head, that's not something you can do in your examination room, is it?" Dr. Shaw's expression grew thoughtful. The procedure would require a proper surgical environment and several hours of uninterrupted work. More importantly, it would require absolute certainty that we wouldn't be discovered while the surgery was in progress. If the people looking for Eli found us during the operation, the consequences would be catastrophic for everyone involved. Eli stood up, pacing to the window where he could look out at the quiet street beyond Dr. Shaw's iron fence. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the normal sounds of a frontier town going about its daily business. It all seemed impossibly peaceful, given what he'd just learned about the hidden war being fought in the shadows of his life. "Dr. Shaw," he said finally, "if this device can't be safely removed right away, how long do I have before the symptoms become dangerous?" Based on Marcus's notes about similar cases, the deterioration can progress quite rapidly once it begins. Without intervention, you might have weeks rather than months before the device's malfunction causes permanent damage to your brain tissue. "Then we need to move fast," Eli decided, turning back to face her. "But first, I need to understand exactly who we're dealing with and what they want. These government men who've been asking about me, are they part of the original program? Or something else?" Dr. Shaw carefully gathered up the papers and photographs, her movements precise despite the obvious weight of what they discussed. "That, Mr. Renner, is what we need to find out. And I'm afraid the only way to get those answers is to dig deeper into records that some very powerful people have spent years trying to keep buried." That evening, Dr. Shaw spread a collection of topographical maps across her dining room table, each one marked with small red circles and cryptic notations in her late husband's handwriting. The maps covered a vast swath of the Western Territories, from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific coast, and the sheer scope of the markings suggested that Project Meridian had been far more extensive than Eli had imagined. Marcus spent years documenting the locations where Project Meridian operations took place, Dr. Shaw explained, pointing to clusters of red marks scattered across the landscape. Military posts, civilian settlements, even remote trading posts. Anywhere the program could establish temporary surgical facilities without attracting attention. Eli studied the map that covered his home region, noting how many of the marked locations were within a day's ride of places he'd lived or worked during his years of drifting. One circle in particular made his blood run cold. It was positioned directly over the small town where he'd been born, less than 20 miles from where the Broken Arrow Ranch now stood. "This mark here," he said, pointing to the circle near his birthplace. What was that facility? Dr. Shaw consulted a separate notebook filled with her husband's careful documentation. According to Marcus's records, that was a primary research station, designated Facility 7 in the program documents. It operated from 1858 to 1864, conducting both implantation procedures and long-term monitoring of subjects. The facility was shut down when several test subjects, including their families, disappeared during a security breach. My father, Eli said quietly. The telegrams mentioned Facility 7 specifically. Your father wasn't just a participant in the program. Mr. Renner. Based on what Marcus documented, Lieutenant Renner was one of the facility's supervising officers. He would have had access to detailed information about every aspect of the operation, including the locations of other facilities and the identities of all program participants. Miguel, who had been quietly studying the maps from across the table, looked up with a troubled expression. Doc, if Eli's father knew all this information and then disappeared, wouldn't that make the program people mighty nervous about what he might have told his son? Exactly, Dr. Shaw confirmed. From their perspective, Eli represents a potential security breach that's been unresolved for 25 years. His father could have passed along enough information to expose the entire operation and the device implanted in Eli would allow them to track down anyone he might have shared that information with. As Dr. Shaw spoke, memories that Eli had suppressed for years began to surface with uncomfortable clarity. He remembered the strange medical examinations he'd undergone as a young child, procedures that had seemed routine at the time, but now took on a much more sinister significance. Men in white coats had visited their house regularly, always when his father was away on military business, and they'd subjected Eli to tests that had left him feeling sick and disoriented for days afterward. I remember the procedures now, Eli sobbed, his voice barely above a whisper. They told me they were checking to make sure I was healthy, but there were needles and instruments. And afterward, I always felt strange, like I'd forgotten something important. Dr. Shaw's expression grew compassionate but determined. Those were likely calibration procedures, designed to ensure the device was functioning properly and to fine-tune its behavioral modification capabilities. Marcus's notes indicate that children who underwent regular calibrations often experienced memory gaps around the procedures. The devices could be programmed to suppress specific memories. The implications of this revelation made Eli feel physically ill. How much of his childhood had been manipulated? How many of his thoughts and decisions over the years had really been his own? And how many had been influenced by the device embedded in his skull? Dr. Shaw must have recognized his distress, because she reached across the table and placed a steady hand on his arm. Mr. Renner, I want you to understand that whatever influence this device may have had, you've spent the last 25 years living your own life, making your own choices. The behavioral modification capabilities were limited, and they required regular recalibration to be effective. Since you've been living independently, any influence the device has had on your decisions has been minimal. But the constant moving, Eli said, the way I never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots, was that me? Or was that the device keeping me away from places where I might learn too much? Both, probably, Dr. Shaw admitted. The device may have created a subconscious unease that made you want to keep moving, but your decision to finally settle at the Broken Arrow shows that you were able to overcome that influence when you found something worth staying for. Miguel had been studying one of the maps with particular intensity, and now he looked up with an expression of recognition. Doc, this mark here, about 50 miles north of the ranch, I know that area. It's where the old Cameron mine used to operate, before it played out about 10 years ago. But there's still buildings there, and I've seen government wagons heading in that direction more than once over the past few months. Dr. Shaw examined the location Miguel was indicating, cross-referencing it with her husband's notes. Facility 12, she read aloud. According to Marcus's documentation, this was a secondary monitoring station designed to track subjects who had moved beyond the primary operational area. It was supposed to have been shut down with all the other facilities, but maybe it wasn't, Eli finished. Maybe some part of the program continued operating in secret, and that's where the activation signal from my device is coming from. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the implications of this discovery. If Project Meridian was still active, even in a limited capacity, then Eli's situation was far more dangerous than they'd initially believed. The government men asking questions about him weren't just investigating a decades-old security breach. They were actively pursuing him as part of an ongoing operation. There's something else you need to know, Dr. Shaw said, her voice taking on a tone of reluctant honesty. Marcus's records indicate that the Model 3 device implanted in you wasn't just designed for tracking and behavioral modification. It also had a termination function. Eli felt the room seem to tilt around him. Termination? If the program administrators believed a subject posed an unacceptable security risk, they could trigger the device to cause a fatal aneurysm. The death would appear natural, and no autopsy would reveal the true cause unless the examiner knew exactly what to look for. The weight of this revelation settled over Eli like a physical burden. Not only was he being tracked by the device in his head, but the same device could be used to kill him at any moment if whoever was controlling it decided he knew. Too much. Miguel's voice cut through the heavy silence. How long would it take them to use this termination thing once they decided to do it? Based on the technical specifications Marcus documented, the process could be triggered remotely and would take effect within minutes, Dr. Shaw replied. But there's a safeguard built into the system. The termination function can't be activated while the device is malfunctioning. The same deterioration that's causing Eli's current symptoms may actually be protecting him from immediate elimination. So, I'm safe as long as I'm sick, Eli said with bitter irony. But the sickness will kill me anyway if we don't do something about it soon. Dr. Shaw nodded grimly. Which means we need to move quickly to remove the device before they either repair it remotely or decide to take more direct action. But first, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with at this Facility 12 that Miguel identified. Eli stood up from the table, his decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. Then we need to go there and find out. Tonight, while we still have the element of surprise. Eli, that's incredibly dangerous, Dr. Shaw protested. If the facility is still active, approaching it could trigger exactly the kind of response we're trying to avoid. Dr. Shaw, with respect, I've been living in danger my entire life without even knowing it. At least now I understand what I'm facing, and I have people I can trust to help me. If we're going to end this, we need to know what we're up against. Miguel stood as well, his weathered face showing the kind of determination that had made him invaluable during Eli's years of running the ranch. The boss is right, Doc. Sometimes the only way through a problem is straight ahead. And if there's government people at that old mine, we need to know what they're planning before they come. For us, the ride to the abandoned Cameron mine took them through country that Eli knew well from his years of working cattle in the region. But traveling it under cover of darkness transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. They moved slowly, allowing their horses to pick their way carefully along the rocky trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen. Their progress, guided only by the pale light of a quarter moon and Miguel's intimate knowledge of the terrain. Dr. Shaw had insisted on accompanying them despite their protests about the danger, arguing that her medical knowledge might be crucial. If they discovered anything related to the continuing Project Meridian operations, she rode with the quiet competence of someone who had spent years traveling frontier country with her late husband. and Eli found himself grateful for her steady presence as they approached what might be their most dangerous undertaking yet. As they crested a ridge that overlooked the old mining operation, the three of them dismounted and secured their horses before moving forward on foot to get a better view of the valley below. What they saw confirmed Miguel's suspicions and added new dimensions to their understanding of the threat they were facing. The camera mine had supposedly been abandoned for nearly a decade, but the cluster of buildings in the valley showed clear signs of recent occupation. Lights burned in several windows, and a steady stream of smoke rose from multiple chimneys. Most telling of all, a collection of military wagons and what appeared to be a telegraph line had been established, connecting the remote facility with the outside world. "That's not a skeleton crew maintaining empty buildings," Miguel whispered, his voice barely audible in the night air. "That's a full operation running under cover of an abandoned mine." Dr. Shaw had brought a small field telescope that her husband had used during his military service, and through it she was able to make out additional details that painted an even more concerning picture. "I can see guards posted at regular intervals around the perimeter, and there's what appears to be medical equipment being moved between buildings. This isn't just a monitoring station, it's an active research facility." Eli studied the layout of the operation, noting how the existing mine buildings had been modified to accommodate the secretive work being conducted within them. The main shaft house had been expanded with additional wings, and several new structures had been built that bore no resemblance to mining equipment. Most importantly, he could see that the facility had been designed to be completely self-sufficient, with its own power source, water supply, and communication systems. They've been planning this for years, he realized. This isn't a temporary operation. It's a permanent installation designed to continue the work that was supposedly shut down decades ago. As they watched from their concealed position, a figure emerged from the main building and walked deliberately toward what appeared to be a communication center. Even at this distance, Eli could see that the man moved with the precise, disciplined gait of a career military officer. When the figure paused in the light spilling from an open doorway, Dr. Shaw's sharp intake of breath confirmed what Eli was beginning to suspect. "I recognize him," she whispered, adjusting the telescope for a better view. "That's Colonel Hayes. He was Marcus's commanding officer during the final years of Project Meridian. We were told he died in a training accident shortly after the program was officially terminated. But he's very much alive and apparently still running the operation," Eli observed grimly. "Which means the program was never really shut down. It was just moved underground and made even more secretive." The implications of this discovery were staggering. If Project Meridian had continued operating in secret for all these years, then there might be dozens or even hundreds of people still carrying active devices, unaware that they were being monitored and potentially controlled by a shadow military operation. Eli's case wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger conspiracy that had been hidden from public view for decades. As they prepared to withdraw from their observation post, Eli noticed something that made him freeze in place. Walking between two of the buildings was a figure he recognized from the ranch, the same government man who had been asking Miguel questions just days earlier. The man was carrying what appeared to be a thick folder and moving with the urgency of someone delivering important information. "He's here," Eli whispered to Miguel. "The man who came to the ranch, he's working directly with this Colonel Hayes." Miguel's expression darkened. "Which means they know a lot more about your situation than we thought." That fellow wasn't just asking random questions. He was gathering intelligence for an active operation. The Dr. Shaw lowered the telescope and turned to face them both, her expression grave in the moonlight. "Gentlemen, I think we need to accept that we're not just dealing with a medical emergency anymore. What we've discovered here suggests that Elos is the target of a military operation and has resources and authority far beyond anything we can hope to counter directly. The ride back to Sage Creek passed in tense silence, each of them processing the implications of what they'd witnessed at the camera mine facility. By the time they reached Dr. Shaw's house, the eastern sky was beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn, and Eli's condition had worsened noticeably during the night. Of riding and stress, the pain in his ear had intensified to the point where even gentle movements of his head sent waves of agony through his skull, and the dizziness had become so severe that he needed Miguel's assistance to dismount his horse. Inside Dr. Shaw's house, she immediately began examining the deterioration in Eli's condition, a professional concern evident as she noted the increased swelling and the way his pupils responded sluggishly to light. "The stress of tonight's activities has accelerated the device's malfunction," she announced after completing her examination. "We're running out of time much faster than I anticipated." "How much time?" Eli asked, though he suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. "Days, possibly less. The device is now actively damaging the surrounding brain tissue, and if we don't remove it soon, the damage will become irreversible, even if the surgery is successful." Miguel, who had been standing guard at the window, suddenly stiffened and gestured for them to be quiet. "Someone's coming," he whispered. "Multiple riders, moving fast." Through the pre-dawn gloom, they could see a group of mounted men approaching Dr. Shaw's house at a gallop. Even in the dim light, it was clear that these weren't casual visitors. They moved with military precision and purpose that suggested an organized raid rather than a social call. "They found us," Dr. Shaw said, her voice remaining calm despite the obvious danger. "We need to leave immediately, and we need to take everything related to Project Meridian with us. If they get their hands on Marcus's records, any hope of exposing this operation will be lost forever." Eli struggled to his feet, fighting through the waves of pain and disorientation that threatened to overwhelm him. "Where can we go? If they know about this place, they probably know about the ranch too." Dr. Shaw was already moving, gathering up her husband's journals and the topographical maps with efficient speed. "There's a place, an old cabin that Marcus used during his research into the abandoned Project Meridian sites. It's remote enough that we should be safe there for a few days, and it has the medical equipment I'll need to attempt the surgery to remove your device." The sound of horses' hooves on the street outside was growing louder, and Miguel reported that the riders had split up to surround the house. "Doc, whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now. They'll have the place locked down in another minute." Dr. Shaw led them quickly to a back door that opened onto a narrow alley behind her house. "My horse is saddled and waiting in the stable." Behind the house, I prepared for the possibility that we might need to leave quickly. "Can you ride, Mr. Renner?" Eli nodded, though he wasn't entirely certain that was true. The pain in his head was becoming overwhelming, and his vision was beginning to blur at the edges in a way that suggested the device's malfunction was accelerating beyond Dr. Shaw's most pessimistic projections dot as they slipped out into the alley. They could hear the sound of the front door being broken down and voices shouting orders inside the house. Whatever window of opportunity they'd had was closing rapidly, and Eli realized that their next few decisions would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise and whether the truth about Project Meridian would ever see the light of day. The cabin that Dr. Shaw led them to was hidden deep in a canyon 15 miles from Sage Creek, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense stands of pine and over rocky terrain that would challenge even experienced riders in broad daylight. By the time they reached the remote structure, Eli was barely conscious, clinging to his saddle horn while waves of pain and nausea threatened to unseat him with every step his horse took. The cabin itself was larger than Eli had expected, built from logs that had weathered to a silver-gray color and positioned to be invisible from any direction, except the narrow approach trail. As Dr. Shaw dismounted and began unlocking the heavy wooden door, Eli noticed details that suggested this wasn't just a simple frontier retreat. Iron bars covered the windows. Multiple locks secured the entrance, and the entire structure had been built with the kind of defensive considerations that spoke of someone expecting trouble. Marcus built this place during the final years of his involvement with Project Meridian, Dr. Shaw explained as she helped Eli down from his horse. He knew that someday he might need a place where he could work without interference, somewhere the military authorities couldn't find him. Miguel was examining the surrounding area with the trained eye of someone who understood both tactics and terrain. "This is a good defensive position," he observed. "Anyone trying to approach would have to come up that trail single file, and they'd be exposed for the last quarter mile. But it's also a trap if they do find us. There's only one way in or out." Inside the cabin, Eli found himself in what could only be described as a completely equipped medical facility disguised as a frontier dwelling. The main room contained surgical instruments, medical supplies, and reference books that would have been impressive in any major hospital, let alone a remote mountain hideout. Most striking of all was a collection of glass containers filled with what appeared to be small mechanical devices. Devices that looked disturbingly similar to the technical drawings he'd seen in Dr. Shaw's husband's journals. "Are those?" Eli began, but was interrupted by another wave of pain that left him gasping and disoriented. "Devices that Marcus removed from other Project Meridian subjects over the years," Dr. Shaw confirmed, helping him to a chair positioned near a window, where the morning light provided good illumination. He spent the last decade of his life secretly locating people who had been implanted and offering to help them. "How many people?" Miguel asked, studying the collection of devices with obvious concern. 43 successful removals, Dr. Shaw replied, beginning to lay out surgical instruments on a cloth-covered table. "Though I'm afraid not every case ended well. The devices were designed to be extremely difficult to remove safely, and some subjects had been implanted for so long that the integration with brain tissue was too extensive to reverse." As Dr. Shaw prepared for what would obviously be a complex surgical procedure, Eli found himself studying the cabin's interior more carefully. Something about the arrangement of the medical equipment seemed odd, too organized, too readily accessible, as though this facility was used on a regular basis rather than being an emergency refuge. And the collection of extracted devices was far too extensive to represent the work of a single retired military doctor operating in secret. "Dr. Shaw," Eli said slowly, his suspicion growing despite the pain that made it difficult to think clearly. "How exactly did you know to look for the signs of implantation when I first came to see you? Most frontier doctors wouldn't recognize something that sophisticated." Dr. Shaw's hands paused in their preparation of the surgical instruments. For a moment, her professional demeanor seemed to waver, replaced by something that looked almost like regret. "I told you that my husband documented his work extensively. After his death, I continued his research. But that's not the whole truth, is it?" Eli pressed, fighting through the fog of pain to focus on the inconsistencies that were becoming more apparent. "You knew exactly what to look for because you've been looking for it. You've been actively seeking out Project Meridian subjects." Miguel had noticed Eli's tone and was now watching Dr. Shaw with increased attention, his hand resting casually near the grip of his sidearm. "Doc, what exactly have you been doing up here all these years?" Dr. Shaw set down the surgical instrument she'd been preparing and turned to face them both. The compassionate, professional expression she'd maintained throughout their relationship was gone, replaced by something much more calculating and determined. "You're right, of course," she said quietly. "I haven't been entirely honest about my activities. Marcus's work didn't end with his death. I continued it, but not in the way you might think." She moved to a locked cabinet and withdrew what appeared to be an official document bearing military seals. "Marcus tried to expose Project Meridian through official channels, and for his efforts, he was murdered." The training accident that supposedly killed him was arranged by Colonel Hayes and his associates to silence him before he could reveal what he knew. Eli felt a chill that had nothing to do with his deteriorating condition. You've been working for them. All this time, you've been working for the people who killed your husband. Not working for them, Dr. Shaw corrected, her voice taking on a defensive edge. Working to contain the damage they've done. The devices can't be safely removed in most cases. The integration with brain tissue is too extensive, and the risk of death or permanent disability is too high. But the memories associated with Project Meridian can be suppressed, allowing the subjects to live normal lives without the psychological trauma of knowing what was done to them. Miguel's expression had turned hard. You've been erasing people's memories instead of helping them. I've been giving them peace, Dr. Shaw insisted. Do you have any idea what it's like to live with the knowledge that your own government has been monitoring your every move, potentially controlling your thoughts, for decades? Most of the people I've treated have been grateful to forget. The implications of this revelation hit Eli like a physical blow. How many people have you done this to? How many Project Meridian subjects have you found and neutered? Dr. Shaw's composure cracked slightly, revealing the weight of years of morally questionable decisions. 43, as I told you. But I saved their lives, Mr. Renner, without memory suppression. Most of them would have been terminated by the program administrators rather than risk exposure. And what about the people who didn't want to forget? Eli demanded. What about the ones who wanted to fight back, to expose what was done to them? Dr. Shaw's silence was answer enough, and Eli felt a surge of rage that temporarily overwhelmed even the pain in his head. You killed them. You used your medical knowledge to silence anyone who might threaten the secrecy of the program. I protected the greater good, Dr. Shaw said, but her voice lacked conviction. The program affects hundreds of people, possibly thousands. Exposing it would destroy innocent lives and potentially destabilize. Don't. Miguel interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people stop talking and start listening. Don't try to justify what you've done with. Talk about the greater good. You've been murdering people to protect the conspiracy. Dr. Shaw straightened, and for the first time since Eli had known her, he saw the steel beneath her professional demeanor. What I've been doing is making impossible choices in an impossible situation. And now you're forcing me to make another one. She moved toward the surgical instruments with deliberate intent, and Eli realized with growing horror that she wasn't preparing to remove his device. She was preparing to suppress his memories, just as she had done with the 43 people who had trusted her to help them. The memory suppression procedure is painless, Dr. Shaw continued, her voice returning to its clinical tone. You'll wake up believing that your ear problems were caused by a simple infection that I treated successfully. You'll return to your ranch and live a normal life, free from the knowledge that's been tormenting you. And if I refuse? Eli asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Dr. Shaw's expression grew genuinely sad. Then I'll have to ensure that you can't threaten the safety of the other subjects I've been protecting. I'm sorry, Mr. Renner. I truly hoped it wouldn't come to this. Miguel's hand was now openly resting on his weapon. Doc, I think you need to step away from those instruments and think real carefully about what you're planning to do. Mr. Esperanza, you don't understand the full scope of what's at stake here, Dr. Shaw replied, but she made no move to step away from the surgical table. The Project Meridian subjects aren't just scattered individuals, they're connected through the devices in ways that create a network spanning the entire Western territories. If that network is exposed, the resulting chaos could destabilize the entire region. Eli struggled to his feet, fighting through the pain and disorientation that seemed to be getting worse by the minute. You're not protecting people, Dr. Shaw. You're protecting the system that's been controlling them. You've become part of the very conspiracy that killed your husband. For a moment, Dr. Shaw's clinical mask slipped entirely, revealing a woman who had spent years living with the weight of impossible choices and mounting compromises. He would have understood, she said quietly. Marcus would have seen that sometimes the only way to help people is to take away their ability to hurt themselves and others. No, Eli said with sudden clarity. Your husband spent his life documenting the truth so that someday someone could use that information to expose what was done and help the victims. You've perverted his work into something he would have despised. Dr. Shaw's hand moved toward a syringe filled with clear liquid, the memory suppression drug she'd used on dozens of other Project Meridian subjects. I'm trying to save your life, Mr. Renner. The device in your head is deteriorating rapidly, and without immediate intervention, you'll be dead within hours. I can remove the memories of this entire experience and treat the physical symptoms, giving you a chance at a normal life. A life built on a lie, Miguel observed. A life where he never knows who he really is or what was done to him. A life, Dr. Shaw emphasized, which is more than Colonel Hayes and his people will offer him if they succeed in locating this facility. Even as she spoke, the sound of horses approaching on the narrow trail reached them through the cabin's thick walls. Dr. Shaw's expression shifted from determination to alarm as she realized that their refuge had been discovered far sooner than she'd anticipated. How did they find us so quickly? Miguel demanded, moving to a window where he could observe the approaching riders. Dr. Shaw's face went pale with the realization of what had happened. The device, she whispered. It's not just malfunctioning, it's transmitting a stronger signal because of the deterioration. They've been tracking us all along. Eli felt the pieces of the puzzle click into place with horrible clarity. You knew this would happen. You brought us here knowing they would follow. I thought we would have more time, Dr. Shaw protested. But her explanation was cut short by Miguel's urgent report from the window. 6 riders, all armed, and they're spreading out to surround the cabin. One of them is that Colonel Hayes you identified, and he's carrying what looks like some kind of electronic device. Dr. Shaw moved quickly to a hidden panel in the cabin's wall, revealing a cache of weapons and what appeared to be additional medical equipment. There's still time to complete the memory suppression procedure, she said desperately. If I can finish it before they break in, you'll be useless to them as a source of information about the other subjects. And what about you? Eli asked. What happens to the doctor who's been helping them cover up their crimes for all these years? Dr. Shaw's expression hardened with resolve. I've always known this day might come. Marcus prepared this place with more than just medical equipment. It also contains enough explosive material to destroy all evidence of our work here. The implications of her statement sent a chill through Eli's already compromised system. Dr. Shaw wasn't just planning to suppress his memories. She was planning to eliminate everyone in the cabin to protect the secrecy of Project Meridian. You're going to kill us all, Miguel said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. After everything you've told us about protecting people, you're going to murder us to keep your secrets safe. I'm going to make sure that the network of Project Meridian subjects remains protected, Dr. Shaw corrected. Even if that means sacrificing the 3 of us to preserve the safety of hundreds of others. Outside, they could hear Colonel Hayes shouting orders to his men, positioning them around the cabin to prevent any possibility of escape. The electronic device he carried was apparently some kind of signal booster, designed to override the device in Eli's head and either repair its function or trigger its termination protocol. Eli realized that he was facing a choice between 3 equally unacceptable options. Allow Dr. Shaw to suppress his memories and live as someone else. Be captured by Colonel Hayes and either controlled or killed by the device in his head, or die in an explosion designed to protect a conspiracy that had already destroyed countless lives. But as he looked around the cabin at the evidence of Dr. Shaw's years of work, the extracted devices, the medical equipment, the detailed records of people who had trusted her to help them. Eli saw a fourth option that none of them had considered. "Dr. Shaw," he said quietly, "your husband's records are all here, aren't they? Everything he documented about Project Meridian, all the evidence that could expose what they've been doing?" "Yes, but that information can never be allowed to. Then, we need to make sure it gets to people who can use it," Eli interrupted. "Not to protect the conspiracy, but to destroy it." Miguel caught on to what Eli was thinking. "The telegraph line we saw at the mine facility, if we could get word out to newspapers, to government officials who aren't part of the cover-up, the evidence in this cabin could bring down the entire operation." Eli finished. "But only if it survives long enough to be found by the right people." Dr. Shaw stared at them both as the full implications of what they were proposing became clear. For 25 years, she had worked to protect Project Meridian's secrecy, convincing herself that she was helping the victims by hiding the truth. Now, she was being asked to choose between preserving that secrecy and exposing the conspiracy that had cost her husband his life. The sound of Colonel Hayes and his men preparing to storm the cabin grew louder, and Eli knew they had only moments to decide how this would end. The device in his head was sending waves of agony through his skull, but for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt a sense of clarity about what needed to happen. "The choice is yours, Dr. Shaw," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "You can complete the work your husband started, or you can destroy it to protect the people who killed him. But you can't do both." The sound of splintering wood announced that Colonel Hayes and his men had begun their assault on the cabin's defenses. Dr. Shaw stood frozen between the surgical instruments that could suppress Eli's memories and the hidden panel that contained her husband's accumulated evidence against Project Meridian. For a woman who had spent years making morally complex decisions with clinical precision, she seemed paralyzed by the stark choice that now confronted her. "Dr. Shaw," Eli said urgently, fighting through waves of pain that were becoming almost unbearable. "If you ever loved your husband, if you ever believed in the work he was trying to do, and help us finish it." Miguel had positioned himself at the main window with a rifle he'd taken from Dr. Shaw's weapons cache, but he could see that their defensive position was rapidly becoming untenable. "Whatever we're gonna do, we need to decide fast. They've got the front and back exits covered, and they're bringing up what looks like demolition equipment." Dr. Shaw suddenly moved with decisive purpose, abandoning the medical instruments and instead gathering up her husband's journals and documentation. "There's a root cellar beneath the cabin," she said quickly. "It connects to a natural cave system that Marcus explored during his time here. The passage leads to an exit about half a mile down the canyon, hidden behind a rockfall that looks natural from the outside." "Can we get the evidence out that way?" Eli asked, even as another surge of pain from the device made him grip the table for support. "The passage is narrow and difficult, but it's our only chance." Dr. Shaw was already wrapping the most important documents in waterproof cloth and securing them in a leather satchel. "But someone needs to stay here to delay Colonel Hayes and his men to give the others time to reach the hidden exit." Miguel understood the implication immediately. "I'll stay. I know how to hold a position, and I can buy you the time you need." "No," Eli said firmly. "This is my fight, and I'm the one they're really after. Take the evidence and get it to people who can use it. I'll handle Hayes." Dr. Shaw looked at him with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Mr. Renner, the device in your head is deteriorating rapidly. The stress of combat could trigger a complete malfunction that would kill you instantly." "Then I guess I'd better make sure this ends quickly," Eli replied, checking the loads in the revolver Miguel had given him from Dr. Shaw's weapons collection. The sound of the front door being battered down ended their debate. Colonel Hayes' voice echoed through the cabin as his men began their systematic search of the rooms. "Dr. Shaw, I know you're in here. Bring out the Renner subject and no one else needs to be harmed. Dr. Shaw activated a hidden mechanism that opened a section of the floor, revealing a ladder that led down into darkness. "The passage forks about 100 yards in," she whispered. "Take the left branch, it leads to the exit. The right branch leads to a dead end where Marcus stored additional supplies." As Miguel prepared to descend into the hidden passage with the precious documentation, Eli caught his arm. "If you don't make it out, if this all goes wrong—" "It won't," Miguel said with quiet confidence. "But if it does, you make sure these military people know they picked the wrong cowboy to mess with." Dr. Shaw paused at the top of the ladder, looking back at Eli with an expression that carried the weight of years of moral compromise and missed opportunities for redemption. "Mr. Renner, I want you to know that what I did, the memory suppressions, the cover-ups, I truly believed I was protecting people. But you've shown me that some truths are too important to hide, no matter how painful they might be." "Your husband would be proud," Eli told her, and saw her eyes fill with tears before she disappeared into the hidden passage. Left alone in the cabin as Colonel Hayes and his men closed in, Eli found himself thinking about the letter his father had hidden in the cavalry saber's scabbard. James Renner had spent his final years trying to protect his son from the very forces that were now converging on this remote mountain hideout. The irony wasn't lost on Eli that he was about to confront the same enemy his father had died fighting, in a place that represented both the last hope for exposing the truth and a potential tomb for everyone involved. The device in his head was sending increasingly severe waves of pain through his skull, and Eli could feel his vision beginning to blur at the edges. Whatever malfunction was occurring was accelerating, possibly triggered by stress or proximity to the electronic equipment Colonel Hayes was using to track him. If Dr. Shaw was correct about the deterioration process, he might have minutes rather than hours before the device either killed him or rendered him unconscious. Colonel Hayes appeared in the doorway of the main room, flanked by two armed men in military uniforms. The officer was older than Eli had expected, perhaps 65, with gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades giving orders and having them obeyed without question. Most unsettling were his eyes, cold and calculating in a way that suggested he viewed other people as resources to be managed rather than human beings deserving of consideration. "Mr. Renner," Colonel Hayes said in a tone that might have been used for discussing the weather, "you've caused us considerable trouble over the past few days. I trust Dr. Shaw has explained the nature of your situation and the limited options available to resolve it." Eli remained standing near the surgical table, his hand resting casually near his weapon, but not making any overtly threatening moves. "She explained that you've been experimenting on people for decades and murdering anyone who might expose what you've been doing. I prefer to think of it as managing a complex security situation that has implications far beyond any individual case," Colonel Hayes replied. "The Project Meridian Network represents one of our most valuable intelligence assets. The subjects provide us with information about activities in remote areas that would otherwise be impossible to monitor." "You mean you've been using people as unwilling spies, forcing them to report on their own communities without even knowing they're doing it?" Colonel Hayes moved further into the room, his men positioning themselves to block any potential escape. "Roots. The behavioral modification capabilities of the devices are quite sophisticated. Subjects can be programmed to observe and remember specific types of information, then report that information during regular medical examinations that they believe are routine health checkups." The casual way the colonel discussed the violation of so many people's minds and autonomy made Eli's anger burn hot enough to temporarily override the pain in his head. "How many people are you controlling currently?" "Approximately 300 active subjects across the Western Territories, with additional subjects being prepared for activation as needed. It's a remarkably efficient system for gathering intelligence about everything from Indian activities to foreign infiltration to domestic unrest. And the people who figure out what's being done to them, Colonel Hayes' expression didn't change, are dealt with as security necessities dictate. We prefer memory suppression when possible. Dr. Shaw has been quite effective in that regard, but termination is sometimes required. Eli now understood the full scope of what he was dealing with. Project Meridian wasn't just a rogue military operation. It was a systematic program of mind control that had been operating in secret for decades, using unwilling subjects as a network of unconscious agents throughout the frontier territories. The government men who had been asking questions about him weren't investigating a security breach. They were maintaining an ongoing intelligence operation. "Where is Dr. Shaw?" Colonel Hayes asked, his tone becoming more businesslike. "We need her to complete the memory suppression procedure before we can safely transport you back to the primary facility." "She's not here," Eli replied, which was technically true since she had disappeared into the hidden passage minutes earlier. "My men have searched the other rooms and found no trace of her or the Mexican who was with you. Since this cabin has only one entrance, and we've had it surrounded since before dawn, I can only assume they're hiding somewhere within the structure." One of the colonel's men approached and whispered something that made the older officer's expression darken with concern. "It appears that some of Dr. Shaw's research materials are missing from the cabin. That's unfortunate. Those documents contain sensitive information about the location and identity of our active subjects." Eli felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. If Miguel and Dr. Shaw had successfully escaped with the evidence, then his job was simply to delay Colonel Hayes long enough for them to reach safety and get the information to people who could act on it. "Colonel," Eli said, his voice steady despite the increasing pain in his head, "I think you should know that your Project Meridian operation is about to be exposed to the world. Those missing documents are going to people who can make sure everyone knows what you've been doing." For the first time, Colonel Hayes showed genuine emotion, a flash of anger that transformed his cold features into something genuinely frightening. "Mr. Renner, you have no comprehension of the damage such exposure would cause. The Project Meridian subjects aren't just intelligence assets. Many of them have been programmed with specific responses that will be triggered by widespread publicity about the program. The resulting chaos could destabilize the entire territorial government." "Maybe it's time for that government to be destabilized," Eli replied. "Maybe people deserve to know when their own military is experimenting on them." Colonel Hayes reached into his jacket and withdrew a small electronic device about the size of a pocket watch. "This is a direct control unit for Model 3 tracking devices. Despite the deterioration you've been experiencing, I can still use it to trigger the termination protocol in your implant. You'll be dead in seconds, and then my men will search this cabin until we find Dr. Shaw and recover those documents." Eli looked at the device in Colonel Hayes' hand and realized that his father's letter had been wrong about one crucial detail. The device could be triggered even while malfunctioning. In fact, the deterioration might make the termination protocol even more effective and immediate. But as the pain in his head reached a crescendo that made it difficult to remain standing, Eli also realized something else. The device that was supposed to be his weakness might also be his greatest weapon in the fight that was about to determine whether Project Meridian would continue operating in the shadows or finally face the light of public exposure. Colonel Hayes raised the control device, his finger poised over what Eli assumed was the activation switch for the termination protocol. The two soldiers flanking him had their weapons drawn but weren't aiming directly at Eli apparently. They expected the electronic device to handle the threat without need for conventional firearms. "This doesn't have to end in your death, Mr. Renner," Colonel Hayes said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of someone negotiating a business transaction. "If you can tell me where Dr. Shaw and your associate have gone, I can modify the device's settings to simply render you unconscious rather than triggering termination." You'll wake up at our medical facility with no memory of any of this, and you can return to your ranch to live a normal life. Eli felt the pain in his head intensify as the malfunctioning device responded to the proximity of Colonel Hayes' control unit. But instead of the crippling agony he'd been experiencing, the pain was beginning to transform into something else, a strange clarity that seemed to sharpen his awareness of everything happening around him. "Colonel," Eli said slowly, fighting to keep his voice steady, "I think there's something you don't understand about this device you put in my head." "I understand it perfectly. I helped design the Model 3 series. I have personally supervised the termination of more than a dozen subjects who pose security risks to the program." But even as Colonel Hayes spoke, Eli could see uncertainty flickering in the older man's eyes. The electronic control unit in his hand was displaying readings that apparently didn't match what he expected to see from a deteriorating Model 3 device. The truth hit Eli with sudden, shocking clarity. The device in his head wasn't just malfunctioning, it was evolving, adapting to the damage in ways that its original designers had never anticipated. The pain he'd been experiencing wasn't just the result of deterioration. It was the device attempting to repair itself and, in the process, creating new neural pathways that enhanced rather than controlled his mental processes. "You can't trigger the termination protocol," Eli realized aloud. "The device has changed. Too much. Your control unit can't interface with it anymore." Colonel Hayes' expression shifted from confidence to alarm as he studied the readings on his control device more carefully. "That's impossible. The Model 3 devices were specifically designed to prevent any form of autonomous evolution. But you didn't account for what would happen after 25 years of integration with a growing brain." Eli continued, his mind working with a clarity he'd never experienced before. "The device didn't just track me, it learned from me. And now it's become something you can't control." One of the soldiers stepped forward, apparently concerned by his commanding officer's obvious distress. "Sir, should we proceed with conventional termination methods?" Colonel Hayes was staring at his control device as though it had betrayed him. "The readings indicate the subject's device is not only operational, but actively interfering with the control signal. This shouldn't be possible." Eli could feel the device in his head responding to the electronic signals from Colonel Hayes' control unit, but instead of shutting down his consciousness or triggering a fatal aneurysm, it seemed to be analyzing and countering each attempted command. The pain was still there, but it was being processed and filtered in ways that allowed him to function despite its intensity. "Colonel," Eli said, taking a step closer to the older man, "I think it's time you learn what happens when your experimental subjects start fighting back." The enhanced mental clarity provided by his evolved device allowed Eli to process information and plan his actions with extraordinary speed and precision. He could see the exact positions of the two soldiers, note the slight tremor in Colonel Hayes' hand that indicated stress, and calculate the most effective way to neutralize all three threats simultaneously, moving with speed that surprised even himself. Eli grabbed the surgical table and overturned it, sending medical instruments clattering across the floor while providing himself with cover from the soldiers' weapons. At the same time, he drew his revolver and fired twice in rapid succession, targeting not the men themselves but the oil lamps that provided illumination for the cabin's interior. The room plunged into near darkness as the lamp shattered, there, burning oil spreading across the wooden floor and creating patches of flickering flame that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. In the confusion, Eli rolled behind the overturned table and fired again, this time aiming for Colonel Hayes' control device. The electronic unit exploded in a shower of sparks and metal fragments, and with its destruction, Eli felt the constant electronic interference in his head suddenly cease. The pain didn't disappear entirely, but it became manageable for the first time in days. allowing him to think and move without the crippling distraction he'd been enduring. Colonel Hayes staggered backward, clutching his hand where fragments from the destroyed control device had cut him. "Kill him," he shouted to his men. "Use whatever force is necessary." But the soldiers were having difficulty locating their target in the smoke-filled, dimly lit cabin. Their shots went wide, embedding themselves in the cabin's log walls, while Eli used his enhanced awareness to track their movements and plan his counterattack. The device in his head was no longer a source of pain and confusion. It had become a weapon that gave him advantages his enemies couldn't match. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Eli felt like he had a real chance of winning the fight that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of hundreds of other Project Meridian subjects who deserved to know the truth about what had been done to them. The spreading fire from the broken oil lamps transformed the cabin into a battlefield of flickering shadows and choking smoke. Eli used his enhanced awareness to track the movements of Colonel Hayes' men while they struggled to locate him in the chaos. The device in his head, now freed from the electronic interference of the control unit, was providing him with sensory information that seemed almost supernatural in its precision. He could hear the slight scrape of boot leather on wooden floorboards that told him one soldier was moving toward the overturned surgical table. The change in air pressure near the broken window indicated the second soldier was trying to flank him from that direction. Most importantly, he could sense Colonel Hayes retreating toward what he probably thought was the cabin's only exit, unaware that Dr. Shaw and Miguel had already escaped through the hidden passage. Eli fired 3 shots in rapid succession, not aiming to kill but to force the soldiers into defensive positions that would limit their mobility. The enhanced mental processing provided by his evolved device allowed him to calculate angles and trajectories with mathematical precision, placing each bullet exactly where it would do the most good in terms of tactical advantage. The subject has been enhanced beyond normal parameters. Colonel Hayes shouted to his men, his voice carrying a note of genuine fear for the first time since entering the cabin. The device integration has exceeded all projected capabilities. One of the soldiers called back through the smoke, "Sir, should we withdraw and request additional support?" "Negative." Colonel Hayes' response was immediate and vehement. "This cabin contains evidence that could destroy the entire Project Meridian network. We cannot allow the subject or the documentation to escape." But even as the colonel spoke, Eli could hear the sound of horses approaching rapidly from outside reinforcements that Colonel Hayes had apparently called for when his control device failed to perform as expected. The tactical situation was about to become much more complex, with potentially dozens of armed men surrounding the burning cabin. Eli realized that his fight was no longer just about personal survival or even exposing Project Meridian to the world. The evolved device in his head represented something that Colonel Hayes and his associates had never anticipated, and couldn't control proof that their experimental subjects could not only resist their conditioning, but potentially turn their own technology against them, moving with the fluid precision that his enhanced awareness made possible. Eli circled around the cabin's interior, using the smoke and shadows to approach Colonel Hayes from an unexpected angle. The older man was focused on coordinating with his arriving reinforcements through a small speaking trumpet, apparently unaware that his primary target was now less than 10 feet away. "Colonel," Eli said quietly, and saw the older man spin around, with shock and growing panic in his eyes. "This is impossible," Colonel Hayes whispered, staring at Eli as though he were seeing a ghost. The behavioral modification protocols should have prevented any aggressive action against program administrators. "You shouldn't be able to harm me." "Maybe that's true for the original device," Eli replied, keeping his revolver trained on the colonel while listening to the sounds of more soldiers positioning themselves around the cabin. "But this isn't the device you implanted 25 years ago. It's something new, something that learned to think for itself." Colonel Hayes backed toward the wall, his confident demeanor completely shattered by the failure of technology he'd believed was foolproof. "What do you want?" "The program can be modified. The other subjects can be released from their conditioning. We can negotiate a settlement that protects everyone involved." "I want you to understand something, Colonel," Eli said, his voice carrying the weight of years of unconscious manipulation and violation. "Every person you experimented on, every life you destroyed to protect your secrets, every family that was broken up by your program, they all deserve better than to be treated as laboratory animals in your research." The sound of boots on the cabin's front porch announced that Colonel Hayes' reinforcements were preparing to storm the building. Eli knew he had only moments before the tactical situation became impossible to manage, even with his enhanced capabilities. "The documentation that Dr. Shaw and Miguel escaped with will expose everything," Eli continued. "Every facility, every subject, every crime your program committed. But more than that, it will prove that your experimental subjects can overcome your conditioning and fight back." Colonel Hayes' face was pale with the realization that his life's work was about to be destroyed by the very technology he'd helped create. "You don't understand the broader implications. Without Project Meridian, we lose critical intelligence capabilities that protect national security interests across the entire frontier. Then maybe it's time to find ways to protect those interests without violating people's minds and bodies," Eli replied. The front door exploded inward as Colonel Hayes' reinforcements launched their assault on the cabin. But instead of finding a trapped subject ready for termination or capture, they found something none of them had been trained to handle: a Project Meridian subject whose device had evolved beyond their ability to predict or control, and who was now using their own technology to fight back against the system that had created him. The burning cabin erupted into a firefight that would determine whether Project Meridian continued operating in the shadows or finally faced the justice that decades of hidden crimes had made inevitable. 3 months after the fire that consumed Dr. Shaw's mountain cabin, Eli Renner stood in the cemetery outside Sage Creek, placing a simple granite marker beside the graves of other frontier residents who had lived and died far from the places of their birth. The stone bore only a name, Dr. Meredith Shaw, and the dates of her life. But to Eli, it represented something much more significant than a memorial to a complicated woman who had spent her final hours choosing redemption over self-preservation. The hearing loss in his left ear served as a constant reminder of everything that had happened during those desperate days when Project Meridian's secrets had finally been dragged into the light. The evolved device had been successfully removed by a team of military surgeons who had arrived after Miguel and Dr. Shaw's documentation reached sympathetic officials in the territorial government, but the integration with his brain tissue had been so extensive that complete restoration of function was impossible. Eli found that he didn't mind the partial deafness. It seemed a fair price to pay for the freedom to live his life without electronic surveillance or behavioral modification. And it served as a daily reminder of the importance of listening carefully to the things that people might prefer to keep hidden. The congressional hearings that had followed the exposure of Project Meridian had been conducted largely in closed sessions, but enough information had been made public to confirm that Dr. Shaw's husband's documentation had been accurate in every disturbing detail. Colonel Hayes and 17 other military officers had been court-martialed and imprisoned, and the facilities at the Cameron mine and 6 other locations had been shut down and their equipment destroyed. More importantly, the 312 surviving Project Meridian subjects had been located and offered medical treatment to remove their devices safely. Some had chosen to undergo the risky surgery, while others had opted to live with the inactive implants rather than risk the potential complications of removal. All had been provided with full documentation of their involvement in the program and financial compensation for the years of violation they had endured. Eli had chosen removal. despite the warnings about potential hearing loss and other complications. The idea of carrying any part of Colonel Hayes' technology in his body for the rest of his life had been unacceptable, regardless of the medical risks involved. The surgery had taken 7 hours and had required 3 of the country's most skilled military physicians. But when he awakened, the constant electronic presence that had shaped his thoughts for 25 years was finally gone. Standing in the cemetery as the autumn wind rustled through the cottonwoods, Eli reflected on how different his life felt without the unconscious behavioral modifications that had driven him to keep moving, to avoid questions, to maintain the isolation that had protected Project Meridian's secrets. For the first time since childhood, his thoughts and decisions felt entirely his own. The Broken Arrow Ranch was thriving under his full attention, no longer divided between running cattle and unconsciously processing information for military intelligence purposes. Miguel had been officially recognized for his role in exposing the conspiracy and had used his reward money to purchase land adjacent to Eli's property, expanding their operation and providing employment for several other ranch hands who had proven their loyalty during the dangerous days of confronting Colonel Hayes. A letter had arrived just that morning from another Project Meridian survivor, a woman in Colorado, who had undergone successful device removal and wanted to share her story of recovery and rebuilding. It was the 14th such letter Eli had received since the hearings concluded, and each one reinforced his belief that the pain and risk they had all endured had been worthwhile. Dr. Shaw's sacrifice in the burning cabin had ensured that her husband's documentation reached the right people at the crucial moment, but she had paid for that choice with her life. The official report stated that she had died in an accidental fire while attempting to destroy sensitive medical records. But Eli knew the truth was more complex. She had spent her final hours choosing to honor her husband's memory, rather than continue protecting the conspiracy that had killed him. The marker Eli had placed was simple and dignified, the kind of memorial that Dr. Shaw herself might have chosen. It gave no indication of the moral complexity that had characterized her involvement with Project Meridian, nor did it hint at the courage she had shown in ultimately choosing truth over self-preservation. But Eli believed that was appropriate some. Stories were too complicated for Granite and Bronze to tell properly. As he prepared to leave the cemetery, Eli noticed a young man approaching hesitantly along the path between the graves. The stranger was perhaps 25, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested someone carrying questions they weren't sure they wanted answered. "Excuse me," the young man said as he drew closer. "Are you Eli Renner? The man who was involved in that government hearing about the medical experiments?" Eli studied the stranger's face, noting the subtle signs of stress and uncertainty that he'd learned to recognize in other Project Meridian survivors. "I am? And you are?" "Thomas Mitchell," the young man replied. "I've been having some strange symptoms lately. Headaches, dizziness, memory gaps that don't make sense. My doctor back in Denver said you might be someone who could help me understand what's happening." Eli felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with being one of the few people who fully understood what Project Meridian had done to its victims. The program had been officially shut down, but its effects would continue to ripple through people's lives for years to come. "Mr. Mitchell," Eli said gently, "I think we need to have a long conversation. But first, let me ask you, do you remember anything unusual about your childhood? Any medical procedures that seemed more complicated than they should have been?" As they walked together toward town, Eli reflected on how his life had come full circle. He had begun as an unwilling victim of Project Meridian's experiments, but he had ended up as someone who could help other victims understand and overcome what had been done to them. It wasn't the life he would have chosen, but it was meaningful work that honored both his father's sacrifice and Dr. Shaw's final choice to stand with the truth. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery as they walked away, and Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang the kind of clear, uncomplicated song that Eli had learned to appreciate with his remaining hearing. It was the sound of freedom, and after 25 years of electronic surveillance and behavioral control, he found it more beautiful than any music he'd ever heard.